Alright guys, this should be an interesting series to tackle. So, welcome back to a response video. It's been quite a while since I did one of these, and I was starting to think that I'd never find something else good to respond to, but oh Monstrum, you just keep popping up on my radar, presenting very biased discussion points. Look, from my personal point of view, the discussion of monsters, their influences, and their origins is one of the most fascinating topics one can engage in. I love monsters. I love talking about them. I love talking about mythology, the origins and talking points that come from monsters. Why do we create monsters? How much truth and validity are in their creation? Are they based on anything specific? What do they show up in terms of pop culture? And are these pop cultural representations good or honest? And I think that Monstrum has the potential to really dive deep into the cultural and scientific explanations behind monsters, as well as their influence on pop culture and media. But quite often, their motivation is more to guilt their audience, as they did with the shark video, about why mankind is the real monster as opposed to the sharks, and how we made them monsters. Or their goal is to push a political agenda, like with Medusa, where they argued that we are afraid of feminine power, and that Medusa represents feminine power, and thus that's why we always try to kill her. This time, though, Monstrum gives us a 3-part series on zombies. Okay, now, before we get too far into this, I should say I don't like zombies all that much, and I made a whole video about my problems with zombies. I don't hate them. It's just they don't really impress me as far as monsters are concerned. Quite often, whenever I watch a zombie TV show or movie, I can really just count the repetitive cliches that pop up again and again and again. And I know that there are some forms of the zombie medium that can change the way we look at it, or they can get a creative idea, but for the most part, a lot of them just look the same to me. But whether I dislike them or not, I do respect the cultural background of zombies and the undead. Undead legends and legacies are aspects of various cultural beliefs, mythologies, and religions across the world. So I could see this 3-part series being a fantastic topic to dive into. But after watching all 3 parts, I have to confess myself very disappointed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tackle the first part today with her talk on the Haitian zombie. And I'll go ahead and admit that this one isn't quite as bad as the next 2 parts, but we're still going to look at it just to be fair, so let's get started. Oh, and before I do start, you know how I normally use my Ravenlord avatar whenever I step in? Normally I do, but just for fun, Hannah did draw this image, so I'm going to use this one from now, at least for this series. It's just all in good fun. I just thought, I have a zombie image, I might as well use it. Alright, so here we go, let's get started.
Thank you to Target for supporting PBS.
Proof that even Target, ironically, can miss the mark.
You would not be watching me here on YouTube if it wasn't for the zombie. I first saw Night of the Living Dead and Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island around when I was 8, which was either a questionable parenting choice or the best one ever. And since then, the idea of the reanimated corpse fascinates me. And yes, I recognize the potential red flags here. I pursued my degree so that I could study the undead and wrote my dissertation about them. And now I'm going to take what I've learned and dig even deeper into the long and complex history of the zombie.
Zombies can be broken down into 3 significant types, and this October, I'm dedicating an entire episode for each one of our undead friends. We'll talk about the origins of each of these zombies throughout history and uncover why the modern zombie continues to hold such a special place in our hearts. Or should I say brains? And along the way, I'll be talking to some experts to get some special insight. This 3-part YouTube series will culminate in a 1-hour documentary airing on PBS. So let's kick it off with the origin of the entire zombie lore, going all the way back to early West African spiritual practices.
Okay, so this is not entirely true. Undead stories and legends have persisted through various cultures, countries, and belief systems. It didn't really start with the Haitian zombies. The terms might have started from there, but in fact, I think the earliest example of our archetypical undead is, at least how we know them, it comes from a quote from the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Ishtar says, quote, "If you do not open the gate for me to come in, I shall smash the door and shatter the bolt. I shall smash the doorposts and overturn the doors. I shall raise up the dead, and they shall eat the living, and the dead shall outnumber the living." And not only this, but, I mean, are you really going to say that the Haitian zombie is really the first and only beginning of all undead, like, lore? What about Draugr from Nordic beliefs? The Revenant from medieval European folklore? The Jiangxi of China? The Rolang of Tibet? The Weiderganger, or Rites, of Germany? The Langsuyar of Malaysia? The Vitala of Hindu mythology? Various yokai from Japan could be considered zombies, and of course vampires are another variant of the undead. Saying that the Haitian zombie is the origin of all undead lore is a little inaccurate. In fact, as you'll point out in your second video in the series, the famous zombie we know today, popularized by George A. Romero, was not itself inspired by Haitian zombies, but rather the vampires in I Am Legend. So even the zombies we look at in pop culture were not technically inspired by Haitian zombies. Therefore, you can't even argue that the Haitian zombie is the origin of the pop cultural zombie. I think the only thing the Haitian zombie gives us is the word zombie. But, I mean, as Shakespeare would say, what's in a name? So, yeah. Already off to a bad start, but let's see if you pick up.
I'm Dr. Emily Zarka, and this is Monstrum. You can't talk about the origins of the zombie without talking about the spiritual practice of Vodou.
Oh, sure I can. Watch this. The zombie as we know it is an undead creature that is brought back to life by various means depending on the cultural origin. However, in popular context, they are humans reanimated into walking corpses that feed on the living. End quote. There, look at that. I talked about and explained the basics of zombies without mentioning Haiti at all. Sure, I mean, I left out a few things, but I still got the basics down. You're going to notice that's a running thing in here. They're going to mention things, but not give you the full details. But anyway, let's keep moving.
Vodou is practiced throughout the world, and the concept of the zombie was born out of this religion. Voodoo is different from Vodou, although even now, the lines between them are consistently blurred in popular culture. While one could argue that Vodou is the precursor of voodoo, it's important to understand that they are distinct and separate religions.
Okay, I will keep that in mind. I will keep that in mind, honey. And I will point out every time you interchange the two words throughout this video, because not even your guests seem to know the difference. You said here quite clearly that Vodou is the origin of zombies. Voodoo is either a separate religion altogether or a break-off of the Vodou religion. But you need to clarify if the voodoo has its own variant of zombie or if it's just Vodou. Throughout this video, you, Dr. Zarna, are going to continuously say Vodou, but your guests are going to constantly say voodoo. It sounds very strange when you start off this video saying, hey, they are distinct and separate religions, and yet your own experts don't seem to know the difference. But we'll see more of that later. But again, I will keep it in mind, so I will be pointing it out.
But the original Vodou zombie is a zombie you might not recognize. We need to look back more than 4 centuries to early African spiritual practices. Those legends originated in part from people of West Africa when men, women, and children were forcibly taken from their homes, enslaved, and shipped around the world. The Spanish shipped enslaved people to the island of Hispaniola as early as 1502. In the 17th century, the French began establishing colonies on the island as well, and by 1697, they had obtained control over the western third, what is now Haiti, and named it Saint-Domingue.
Over the course of the 18th century, France established the trade settlements of Les Cayes and Port-au-Prince. With the demand for sugar, tobacco, spice, and coffee in Europe rising, many enslaved Africans ended up on plantations in Haiti where the crops could grow in abundance, bolstering France's economy and becoming crucial to its success as a world power.
By the late 1780s, Saint-Domingue boasted 1/3 of the total people of the Atlantic slave trade, and more than 90% of the island's population was enslaved. The African people on Saint-Domingue came from vastly different geographic, cultural, and spiritual backgrounds. Forced together in Haiti under the horrors of slavery, they developed a new religion to unite their often disparate views, beliefs, and experiences.
Then, okay, no offense, but by that logic, isn't that a good thing? I mean, they unified and overcame their struggle through sharing and creating a new belief system or tradition, and even culture that persists to this day. Kind of reminds me a little of Gullah culture. How something good and unique arose from hardship. I'm not saying it was a good thing. I'm saying, I guess something good came from the hard times. I think that'd be something to celebrate, you know, but okay.
Integral to the Vodou religion is the belief that the human body is merely flesh manipulated by the two spiritual elements that make up the soul, the tibonage and the gros bonage. The tibonage, also called the petit bonage, is the part of the individual able to contact spirits called loas, as well as memory, authority, and consciousness. Essentially, it is their personality, their uniqueness. The gros bonage controls the motor functions of the body, allowing it to move and breathe. Each of these elements can be stolen. For practitioners of Vodou, death is a process that takes time. The soul takes days to move on after death, and until the process is complete, both parts of the soul are at risk of wandering or even capture. This is where the zombie comes in. While the majority of Vodou priests and priestesses use their ability to commune with and influence the spirits in a positive way, a spiritual leader who uses their talents for malicious intent is often called a Bokor. However, it's important to note that others, like Voodoo priest Divine Prince Tayameka, argue that Bokor is a derogatory term rooted in prejudice.
He's a voodoo priest? But I thought that Vodou was the big religion concerning the zombie. You made it very clear that these are two unique and distinct religions. Just pointing that out.
It's assumed, when you say all I've only known it as negative, we're looking at Haiti. And the usage of Bokor in Haiti, which can be negative. They promote themselves in a very negative way. I want it clear that I'm not trying to represent Haitian voodoo, that I'm indeed Louisiana, Mississippi Delta, West African voodoo. So that's another reason why I adopt and earn the right to use Bokor. And so many words, including voodoo, were bastardized once we got to this side of these names, these titles, these lineages. We still fight over them today, particularly in social media.
So, this really doesn't prove anything. I mean, way to say something without saying anything. Basically, all I got from what you said was the terms in and about voodoo are nebulous and ever-changing depending on location. And yeah, that's fine and dandy, but I need to know why Bokor is rooted in prejudice. You didn't answer that. In fact, you said that some Haitians do consider it negative. So then, therefore, is it not right to look at it on a negative? Like, I have no idea what you're saying or why you use this soundbite.
Regardless of what the malicious Vodou practitioners are called, they are identified by their willingness to trap that part of the soul that houses free will, the tibonage, in a bottle. It was believed that whoever possesses the bottle controls the body of a deceased person. Many Haitian and Vodou practitioners believe to this day that zombies are real, albeit rare. It's important to note, however, that Haitian zombies look nothing like those seen in today's popular culture. Vodou zombies are simply shells, mindless workers with no emotions, no ability to feel pain, completely subservient to the whims of their master. They may be brought to this form by administering a poison that causes them to enter a coma-like state in which they are still alive but appear dead. The victim is passed off as a corpse, buried, and then exhumed from the grave as a zombie. Zombification took root as an allegory for colonialism, imperialism, and oppression. After all, is it not a threat worse than death? The idea that one's soul could also be enslaved, and neither it nor the body could be free?
Yes, actually, based on my research, this was a common tactic of the overseers. See, sometimes white slave owners would put other slaves in charge of their slaves, and thus the slave overseers would use the threat of zombification to discourage running away, revolting, or being lazy. After all, if you won't work under free will, we will just take that free will and make you work anyway. But keep in mind, most of the white slave owners probably didn't know all this. So who do you think it was making these threats? Probably the people who are more aware of these cultural beliefs. But that's just speculation. I can't say for sure, so take that with a grain of salt. Moving on.
This is Dr. Cody Roberts, an associate professor who specializes in the history of African Americans in the U.S. and the intersection of black religions such as voodoo.
There's a notion that, well, in the slave system, you have no power, right? Your property, you're owned, your master has complete control of your destiny. But voodoo gives you the chance to exert a power over your enslaver that there's no social parallel for.
Okay, again, what does this have to do with anything? You're saying that voodoo, again, not Vodou, I thought they were unique and different religions, gives you the power to hold something over your slaver? Okay, so you're saying the Haitian slaves thought they could use voodoo against the white man? Well, sorry Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution and one of the most successful revolutionaries in history, I guess you should have focused less on acquiring guns for your soldiers and more on witch doctors. Seems that was the unparalleled thing to do. Oh wait, no, you were successful anyway? Oh, good. I guess you didn't need that. I don't get it.
The Haitian practitioners of Vodou did not fear the zombie itself, as modern audiences fear the flesh-eating zombies who pursue them across the silver screen and into their nightmares. The Haitian slaves were terrified of becoming a zombie.
Voodoo is really a creation out of slavery and enslavement, where they tried to strip away ethnic groups. What makes you unique, what makes you individual, you all are just product. And so that's where it became important.
Wait, voodoo or Vodou? Remember, two very distinct and important religions.
From 1791 to 1804, enslaved Africans revolted against their French oppressors. The violent uprisings eventually led to the Declaration of Haitian Independence in 1804, and slavery was officially abolished there in 1805.
Vodou further evolved in the United States when the practices of the enslaved Haitian people, brought to the States by French slave owners during the Haitian Revolution, were subjected to new influences.
So the voodoo came with them.
Voodoo or Vodou? See, even your supposed guests don't seem to know. I've pointed this out I think 3 times now.
The gumbo mix of West African tradition with indigenous tradition, and of course with those Eurocentric traditions that we, in some cases, were forced to take on, but eventually adopted as sort of a cover and a symbolic representation of something unique to us.
With voodoo, people want to put it all into one box. It has to be one thing. Either this is authentic voodoo or it's not authentic voodoo. If they're black people, then this is voodoo. If they're white people, then it's not. If they're rich people, then it doesn't count. If voodoo is only practiced by poor people in Haiti. I wish people understood that voodoo was just as complicated as every other American religion and treated it that way.
Now, see, you know what? That's fair. I'll take that. I'll even agree to it. But so far, the problem we have here is that we have Dr. Zarka saying Vodou and Voodoo, very different religions, have their origins in slavery, which the voodoo priest earlier argues was the origin of voodoo. So if a white person practices it, is that not cultural appropriation and racist? Also, we don't know anything about Vodou or Voodoo or what makes them different. Zarka isn't willing to go into that. Look, here's the thing. I think it would help if she were more forthcoming, and then we could better understand how voodoo or Vodou applies as a much more complex and open and inclusive religion, if we can even call it that. This guy, this professor or doctor in African American history, he says that he wants people to respect the complexity of voodoo. Great. I want to, but no one in this video is willing to explain anything about it. You're not explaining the positive applications of voodoo. You're not explaining what the general beliefs are. You're not explaining how or why zombies are made. So all we get, therefore, is pop culture to teach us, and you're going to point out later that that's a bad thing, but my response is, well, who else is going to? You haven't taught us anything about voodoo other than they're the origin of zombies, and you haven't pointed out whether it's bad or good that they make zombies, and you're not pointing out any kind of contradiction. So again, you want me to understand the complexities of a religion that you're not willing to talk about. See the problem? And before you say, well, you could go look it up, Raven, I'm sorry, I thought the burden of proof was on these people who were trying to teach me to respect voodoo. Or is it Vodou? Who knows?
At the start of the 20th century, the zombie was still largely unknown to the American public, but that all changed when in 1915, the United States military occupied Haiti. As American journalists and Marines returned from Haiti, they brought stories of the island with them, including stories of the living dead, their exaggerated interpretations of Haitian zombies. One infamous example is William Seabrook's sensational 1929 travelogue, The Magic Island. He described these dead men working as expressionless, with blank eyes like that of a corpse.
This is Dr. Robin Means Coleman, professor and author of Horror Noir.
Seabrook is the one who really, I think, brings this notion of voodoo, the vulgar voodoo, voodoo, back to the States.
Vulgar voodoo? So voodoo that is spelled voodoo is the vulgar voodoo? But Zarka, please tell her that voodoo is a very unique and different religion that deserves respect. Just like that voodoo priest you were talking to. Because you called him a voodoo priest, not a voodoo, a vulgar voodoo priest. It's almost like your guests don't all agree or have the same ideas as what you're spouting. See why this seems a little weird?
He claims that he has gone to Haiti and he has watched this sort of primal, wicked, lustful movement and dance, and it's sensuous and it's uninhibited. And so, this is saying a little bit about Seabrook too. Right. And so this wasn't entirely out of the scope of what we already had a taste for. So he's just expanding that. And we clearly had an appetite for these kinds of stories.
Haiti came to be seen as a place of black magic. The books and newspaper reports were bad enough, but America's perception of voodoo and vodou got worse in 1932 with the release of the first feature-length zombie movie, White Zombie, in which a lovesick man obtained the object of his affections by poisoning her and bringing her back to life as a mindless zombie.
All of these early films are about, it's really about lust, it's about love, it's about someone who is as yet untouchable, and how can I get this person? Well, what does this mean in the 19-teens, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, when the thing that is moving about, in some ways uninhibited, is black?
I can joke all I want, but there are moments I feel like I have to scratch my head and ask, were you so desperate to make this about race? You threw the word black into the explanation where it really didn't fit. You start by saying all these films were about lust, when the only film Zarka mentioned was White Zombie. So what are all these films? What others are you talking about? You then say that the thing moving uninhibited during the 19-teens through the 1930s is black. But what are you talking about? What thing? The thing moving is black? What's black? You mean themes? You mean the monsters? You mean the film elements? You mean the movies? You mean the people going to see the movies? What is the thing moving uninhibited? What is this thing? I feel like this guest doesn't know what she's talking about. I don't know why you pursued her as a guest or why you're using this soundbite. It sounds desperate. The way she's looking around going, it adds nothing. It looks like she's trying to pull an explanation out of thin air. It sounds very much like she's searching for a way to insert race into the discussion when all you had to discuss was how the fanaticism of Haitian zombieism was used in an early movie like White Zombie. That's all you had to say and add. That was it. That was all we needed.
It is important to note that the first zombie ever to grace the silver screen was not black. Neither was the Bokor. White Zombie marks the first instance of white bodies being subjected to zombification.
That's the heightened threat. So White Zombie is a great example of this, although there isn't as much of an overt representation of blacks as zombies, right? But there's still this permeation that this evil, the wickedness of Haiti, comes out of voodoo and has infected, in fact, even white people, right, who are now zombies walking around.
Okay, let me try to understand your argument here and see if I can't help clarify. Your argument here is that in the movie White Zombie, the zombies are not black, they are all white, which you say would be a good thing, because they're not portraying black people as slaves in this. They're showing the white people as the zombies, which is good. And the creator of the zombies is also white. But the problem is that they're portraying zombieism, like the creating of zombies, as a voodoo practice. And it's evil. It's shown as the bad thing, the evil thing. Therefore, they are portraying voodoo as evil. And since voodoo is a black cultural thing, it is portraying a black cultural thing as evil and wicked and backwards, something to be hated or feared. Okay, but a couple things. I see three problems with this argumentation. Number one, Are you denying that making zombies is not a part of Haitian voodoo? Because I thought that was the whole point of this video. The whole point of Zarka's videos here was to talk about the ties to zombies and Haitian voodoo, or Vodou, as she calls it. You don't call it Vodou. No one else calls it Vodou. Everyone else calls it voodoo, so I'm having trouble determining the difference, even though Zarka wanted me to know that they're different. But that's beside the point. That's beside the point. The second problem I see is Zarka made it clear that while most voodoo practitioners, or Vodou practitioners, were benevolent, some, beaucoup, are malicious. They're wicked. They do wicked things with their abilities. Therefore, this white beaucoup is doing malicious things. He is a malicious voodoo practitioner, just like the Shadow Man and Mama Odie in The Princess and the Frog. You got one who's very benevolent and good, the other who's twisted and evil. You know, we can recognize good and evil in the actions. So there is that. And three, and finally, look, I haven't seen the movie, so I can't speak objectively here. I would actually need to see the movie, and frankly, I just don't really care to. But I don't know how much the movie says that this is a Haitian thing and it's evil because it's Haitian. I'm pretty sure they think it's evil because of what the bad guy is doing. Here's the thing. The message of the movie, I don't think, is that Haiti or its people or its beliefs are bad. I think the message of the movie is it's wrong to manipulate the dead. I think that's the real message. Now, do they maybe say in the movie that Haiti is evil and that their practices are evil? I don't know. I haven't seen it. But based on all you've said so far, based on what you've presented to me, I can't say that this is really all that offensive. I mean, I suppose you could try to twist it to be offensive, but I just don't see it.
White Zombie's release occurred the same year that American pulp magazine Strange Tales published the first zombie narrative set in the United States. And where else? A plantation just outside of New Orleans. The 1932 story, The House in the Magnolias by August Derleth, not only demonizes people from Haiti, it shows lingering fears in America by further emphasizing the horrors of slavery, as well as equating black bodies with monstrosity.
All right, folks, you heard it. There it is. These are the rules. This short story demonizes people from Haiti, and it portrays black people as monsters. Those are the two things we're going to see.
A painter from Chicago visiting New Orleans discovers a beautiful old house of white wood buried in magnolias.
Upon knocking on the door, he is confronted with a black woman with a gray cast to her skin and eyes like deep black pools, bottomless, inscrutable, and yet at the same time oddly dull.
She remains mute despite his questions, staring at him unmoving. A beautiful Creole woman interrupts and states that she is the niece of the plantation owner, Aunt Abby, whom she describes as a Haitian who left the island some years ago. She grants him permission to paint the house, but on the conditions that he never brings anyone else to the plantation, never tells anyone he's there, and never gives Aunt Abby any indication he's on the property. He is forbidden from going anywhere inside the house besides the ground floor. But his curiosity gets the best of him, and under the cover of darkness, he explores the house and its surrounding land, where he finds black people working the fields in utter silence. After pressuring Aunt Abby's niece, he learns from her that in Haiti, there are many strange beliefs like the zombie, a dead man who has been brought out of his grave and made to live again and to work. Aunt Abby knows how to create these zombies and keeps the slaves in the cellars during the day. The niece says that if they are given salt, they will know they are dead and will find their way back to their graves. The painter and the niece resolve to free these people. They feed the zombies candy with salt, and one by one they wail terribly and run off into the night. The next day, the house is discovered burned to the ground with Aunt Abby inside.
The newspapers report the discovery of putrefied remains in the half-open graves of slaves whose bodies had been stolen long years ago, and the curious detail that the graves had been half-dug by bare fingers, as if dead hands seek the empty coffins below.
And that's the story. Did it demonize people from Haiti? No, it just said that they have different beliefs. Not that they all practice these beliefs, nor do they condone it, only that the aunt practices it to run her plantation. So your first statement was not entirely accurate. Okay, did it make black people out to be monsters? No, in fact, the black zombies were made to be victims. Undead people forced to work against their will who are saved by a painter and the niece. So, no evil, scary black monsters. You're 0 for 2. In your desperate attempt to make out zombies to be racist in origin, you're doing a very poor job. So, yeah.
The blank stares of the first zombies in literature and film were like blank slates upon which white Americans could write their own anxieties and fears.
No! No! The pale gaze represents their lack of a soul. Have you ever heard the phrase, the eyes are the windows to the soul? They have a pale and empty gaze because they are a husk without a soul. It's not meant for white people to look into and feel their own fears and anxieties manifest. Have you not heard the phrase, their eyes glazed over? Their eyes felt empty and soulless? It's an aspect of death, of a lacking of a soul. You are a desperate person. You are a desperate woman to try to tie this into racism. My goodness.
Because in the 1930s, you're justifying Jim Crow and segregation. So much like you're using race and religion to justify occupation in Haiti, you're using something similar to justify segregation in New Orleans. I would argue that the zombie mythology and that notion of black religion producing these moral evils is tied to that notion of race and backwardness and savagery that is used to justify keeping black people in the position you want them to be in, whether that be a kind of neo-colonialism in Haiti or segregation in New Orleans.
You know what? I'll agree with some of that in theory. I'll agree with that. I think there's a lot of truth there. You're basically saying that back in the 30s, people would use any excuse to segregate people. In fact, they still do that today, I'll be real honest with you. People will use any excuse to try to segregate or differentiate or demonize another person. People do that all the time. White people, black people, Asian people, Hispanic people. We do it all the time. It's nothing new. And you're saying that in the 30s, people might have used the morally evil action of making a zombie, tying it to the black voodoo culture and saying because this is something inherent to black voodoo culture, it is therefore evil. And thus we must segregate people because of that. We must keep ourselves separate from this culture that is so backwards and evil. And, okay, I'm not sure they actually did that. I'm not sure that was an actual practice, but it may have been. I won't deny that. But I have just a couple things to point out. First of all, can you deny the moral evil that is making a zombie? And can you deny also that zombieism came from voodoo lore and belief? No, because as was made very clear in the beginning of the video, Bokor, evil voodoo practitioners, are said to have made zombies. And as Zarka said, many Haitian voodoo practitioners believe that zombies are real, though rare. So it is inherent to the belief and lore of Haitian voodoo practicing. Okay, so there is that. And Bokor are evil people who would do it, so it is considered a moral evil. Therefore, the opinion and position that creating zombies in Haitian voodoo is evil is one that is universally accepted. So if people said, I don't want to associate with someone who would partake in that, I think that's valid. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is that we're talking about movies and propaganda from the 1930s. And people will use anything at any time to sell a narrative. As we've seen today and throughout history, people will do anything to sell a narrative. It doesn't represent truth. And there are plenty of people smart enough, intelligent enough, and educated enough to recognize the lies inherent in most forms of propaganda. And besides, at the end of the day, I don't see the message of these movies, like genuinely these movies like White Zombies. Genuinely, I don't see the message of the movie as we should segregate black people. I see the message of the movie as it is wrong to manipulate death. It is wrong to raise the dead or manipulate the dead for your own ends. That's what I see the message as being. So even if you want to argue that this movie and movies like it are propaganda for segregation, I just don't see that. Again, I haven't seen the movie, but based on what you've shown, I don't see it that way. I see it more as it's wrong to misuse the dead. It's wrong to bring back the dead and use them for your own nefarious purposes, which I think we can all agree on. So even though I agree in spirit with what you're saying about the nature of people using anything to differentiate and demonize, I don't think it works here because I don't think the message of this movie or most zombie movies has to do with segregation. But again, I suppose I have to watch the video, but let's move on.
The Haitian zombie ceded relevance to a more violent version of the undead during the mid-20th century. But popular culture turned its attention back to the original Vodou zombie in the 1980s. In The Serpent and the Rainbow, Wade Davis wrote about his travels to Haiti to study Vodou and the claims that its practitioners were capable of creating real zombies through the use of locally developed poisons.
Show that book again. It clearly says voodoo on the front of the book. The vulgar voodoo. I thought you said they were completely different and shouldn't be confused for each other. I told you guys these words would be interchanged incessantly. It's almost hilarious at this point.
Davis claimed to have discovered two zombie powders, one for causing the appearance of death and the other for reviving the victim. He was able to obtain 8 samples of before powders, all of which he claimed included tetrodotoxin, a psychoactive substance taken from a unique pufferfish. However, later scientific studies of these samples showed little to no tetrodotoxin present, so the jury's still out on that one.
I don't discuss it because, one, it is taboo. Okay. It's dangerous. That information is guarded, it's protected. It's only shared with those qualified to handle that information. So when you start talking about zombies and the making of zombies, that's a tricky conversation.
I love this guy. He's amazing at saying many words that amount to nothing. All I got from that is, I'm not going to talk about making zombies because it's dangerous. Right. Awesome. Glad to hear it. The world remains safe.
Davis's book sparked a renewed interest in Vodou and the original zombie. It had enough of a public impact that Wes Craven directed a film adaptation. The movie aimed to prove that Vodou was a real religion, or so Craven claimed. But in reality, Vodou was misrepresented as the stuff of horror once again.
Again, it makes it very difficult to operate in these traditions and feel your humanity is being acknowledged. People will acknowledge the voodoo before they'll acknowledge my humanity. People will acknowledge, whether it be as a fear of the voodoo or their need of something that they think the voodoo can provide. But they're still not humanizing me or the tradition in the way that we see every day.
All right, let's get a few things out of the way. Firstly, you accuse Wes Craven of creating a movie that inappropriately portrays Vodou as the stuff of horror again. Well, I'm still waiting on you or your priest friend to tell me the truth of Vodou. But let's run with that. Hollywood will always use myth and pop culture and twist it for their needs. They do it with Norse, Japanese, Native American, Chinese, and even Russian mythology. It's done constantly. You shouldn't feel specifically insulted for this because everyone gets it. Instead, you should say, that movie was silly and doesn't represent my beliefs. Let me explain the areas it got wrong. Instead, what you do is you say that it takes away your humanity, that people will identify your voodoo before your humanity. I disagree. I see you as human. And seeing as I know nothing about voodoo and Vodou, since you won't tell me anything, I can't see you as a voodoo doctor or priest or whatever because I have no context as to what is voodoo or what isn't voodoo and what's simply smoke and mirrors. I don't know. If we understood your beliefs and practices better, we might make better content for them. But you seem hesitant to share anything about your belief other than its origins and how they were founded in racist conditions. Now, already I hear some people go into the comments saying, Raven, why don't you just look up information about voodoo or Vodou, and that way you'd know better. I will. After this, I intend to do some heavy research and learn more about it. But here's the reality. This show is meant to educate us about monsters, about the origins of monsters. Don't they have the burden of proof to talk to us about voodoo and Vodou and why the zombie is so relevant to their belief system, why it is an important part of their belief structure and where it came from? Don't just tell me it was birthed from slavery. Tell me what the tenets of voodoo are. What does it try to do? How is it different from normal witchcraft or shamanism? Is it its own form of witchcraft or shamanism? What does it believe? What does it teach us? What are the basic tenets of it? Like, I want to know. But you're not going to tell me anything, and yet you're going to tell me that it's offensive when people who you won't talk to about it don't understand it and make content about it. You want to know why people make these kind of movies where you clearly say that doesn't represent my beliefs? They're the kind of people who don't know any better, and you can help them by educating them. But as you proved a minute ago, you don't want to talk much about certain aspects of voodooism. So don't get upset when someone says, this is how voodoo people make zombies. That's not how it's done. Tell me how it's done. I can't. It's dangerous. Well, then don't stop me from doing it the way I want. See how that works?
Zombies may have their nascency in the spiritual practices of the African diaspora, but popular culture's very liberal interpretations of the original idea mutated the creature into something else entirely.
Okay, but what, per se? No, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you're wrong here. I'm just saying how. You opened up by explaining the basics of Vodou. That it believes in two parts of the soul. One is the personality, one is the motor function. And that when a body dies, it takes some time for the soul to move on. And in that time, it's vulnerable to manipulation or capture or being led astray. Most Vodou priests and practitioners try to guide the souls to the next life. Whereas some who are more malicious and evil, known as Bokor, summon up zombies for some unknown reason. You never really explained why they would do it, what they would use the zombies for, so not really sure like what their intended purpose to use it was for. You then talk about how it may have had ties to slavery and ties to black culture as it tried to endure the days of slavery. So that's essentially the idea of zombieism, you know, created through manipulation of the soul and manipulation of the dead body to create a servant. How did pop culture change that completely? Did it make them good? Did it make them more evil or less evil? Did it change the nature and how it's done? You didn't tell us how it's done. The guy you asked said that he wouldn't talk about it. So how have we changed it completely? How has pop culture altered it completely? Because based on your definition of the zombie and your explanation of the zombie and Haitian practice therein, I don't see where it's changed indefinitely. The only thing that may have changed is how we choose to interpret it, how we choose to read into it. Because you could have treated it as something empowering, but then changed it to something offensive, or changed it from something inherent to slavery and changed it to something inherent to culture. I don't know. How has it changed entirely? That's my question. How has this changed entirely?
In the next episode, we'll look at how the enslaved body, both in mind, spirit, and soul, became the flesh-eating undead. I'll give you a hint. They're coming for you, Barbara.
Well, my name's not Barbara, though according to Hannah, it's Claire. Go figure. Anyway, that's part one down. You can kind of see what we're in for now, right? And to be honest, and this is scary, but this one was the least infuriating. It's just nothing but eggshell walking, avoiding talking about Haitian Vodou while desperately taking sound bites from supposed experts who don't seem to share your views. Despite you saying Vodou and voodoo, no one else you talk to seems to use the term Vodou once, indicating no one else understands it as you do. Despite you saying that Vodou and zombie creation was founded in racism and slavery and that it's wrong for white people to use it in a negative light, you don't explain why it should be positive or otherwise seen. Despite an expert saying that voodoo should be respected as a more complex and unique faith, no one is willing to share anything about voodoo outside of why we should be guilty from its origins. This whole first portion of your documentary is riddled with problems, contradictory testimonies, and basically nothing substantial to take from it. I now know more about the Haitian zombies, and yet at the same time, I feel I know less than I did before. But this is only part one. Tune in next time when Dr. Zarka discusses the Romero zombies, and that will be a very haunting response, I'm sure. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Take care.